What's up guys, TopTierYugioh here, and today I want to show you a Sky Striker ABC deck profile. However, this build isn't ideal, but rather it's going to be a budget version of the deck that I've tried to optimize to be as competitive as possible. Don't worry though, because despite being a budget deck, this is still very capable of destroying most opponents as long as we play the deck well, and I will discuss ways to improve the deck as well as different cards to replace with better ones if you have them available to you. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. And now, as I go through the deck, keep in mind the 5 qualities of the best deck, which were covered in yesterday's video and will be linked in the top right corner of the screen. But all decks need to have these 5 qualities, and those are power, consistency, efficiency, utility, and diversity. Naturally, ABCs are kind of average in terms of both power and consistency, and now the ceiling isn't necessarily low, but it definitely isn't as high as decks like Spiral or Goki. And then in terms of consistency, it's not inconsistent, but we're sort of limited by the maximum number of copies of Union Hanger, which is effectively 6, which isn't amazing. And so we're pretty average in terms of power and consistency, but the deck's real strength is its efficiency, because there's a lot of recursion between the ABC effects and specifically A, and then Dragon Buster's tag out effect is also really efficient. And I always say that as soon as you have access to your first buster, you have access to all 3 of them, and that's a really important factor. And now when it comes to utility and diversity, ABC is maybe average to a bit below average, but in this deck we're not going to worry about that so much. And so the goal is to improve the power and consistency without really having to sacrifice either, and then maybe try to add a bit of utility and diversity if possible, but it isn't necessarily a priority. And so moving on to the actual deck, I want to do something a little bit unorthodox, and that's to start with the extra deck. A lot of our main deck choices do depend on the extra deck, and so it makes sense to make these known beforehand because it'll put a lot of the main deck into context. And so let's go ahead and start with that. First things first, we have our 3 copies of ABC Dragon Buster. This is the most important card in the whole deck. Like, of your total 60 cards, this is the most important one. Next, we have what I sort of call the trifecta of Link monsters. And so these are the most important Link monsters that I summon in the entire deck. These are what really allow us to make a lot of our plays. And so Curious is the card that I focused on in the combo video from the other day. Curious is something that really enables you to summon Buster. You're sending one of the pieces in a lot of cases. You're sending other cards that are good in the graveyard. And having that versatility to send whatever you want makes it a really powerful card on top of the graveyard effects. And so when it leaves the field, you're getting back something that you sent to the graveyard. So you could be getting back a defensive card, or maybe an extender, or maybe a hanger, whatever you might need in any certain scenario. It's going to be able to add back to your hand. And so Curious is just generally a ridiculous card, and so it does enable a lot of the plays. And now Cleafort Genius is another card that I've kind of neglected in the past, but I really enjoy in this build because it's easy to make because it only requires 2 machine monsters, but it's also really good in this current format, especially against Sky Strikers, because the first effect makes it unaffected by spell cards, and so it's hard for opponents to deal with. It's 1800, and so they're not going to be able to deal with it with like an Afterburner or a Jamming Wave, so it's hard for them to deal with, and if you equip it with a piece, it can be a real pain. The other cool thing about the effect is that it can negate face-up cards on the field, and so you can negate Floodgates, you can negate other monsters, you can negate a lot of things, and being able to use that effect really gives us a little bit of an edge. And now the sleeper part of the effect is that when we do tag out our Buster, we're going to be able to summon to both the link points, which will allow us to search a machine monster. And we do play a couple of targets for that actually, and so we're able to fully maximize Cleafort Genius, truly making it a genius card worth using. And now the final part of the trifecta is Akashic Magician. And Akashic Magician is really important because it can also be made very easily, and it points downward, which is important. But then also the effect to excavate from the top of your deck to the graveyard can be really important. And so usually when I tag out, I'll try to go for an Akashic Magician play because it's going to help you get more cards in the graveyard while also helping you add some extenders as well. And something that is also possible is to co-link both of these together. And so when you do that, you're going to get Curious's effect to mill, but you're also going to be able to get Akashic's effect to mill. So you get a lot of milling, you get a lot of pieces in graveyard, and usually it'll end up with double Buster, which is almost always game on that turn. And so these are the 3 trifecta link monsters. Next we have Sky Striker Ace Shizuku and Sky Striker Ace Kagari. Both of these are really good and have very important effects. Kagari especially helps you combo off with Hornet Drones. Shizuku helps you sort of set up for another turn if you really don't have a play. And so like Hornet Drones with Kagari is always 2 link materials, which is important. Well, if we don't have a play, there's no point in doing that, but what we can do is make Shizuku to just search another Hornet Drones. So that will end with 2 Hornet Drones, so we'll still be able to have 2 link materials on the following turn. And so it gives us something to do on the current turn, while still giving us a follow-up. So Shizuku is important, on top of being a water monster, which does help us make Curious. Another interesting thing about both of them is that they are machines, and so using them with another ABC piece or any other machine card in the deck, it can help us make cards like Akashic Magician or Cleave Genius. So actually, the Sky Striker Ace Link monsters allow us to make any 3 of the Link monster trifecta that I just mentioned, and so these are very important. For the Nightmare Link monsters, I only play 1 Phoenix, 1 Cerberus, and 1 Mermaid. All of these are important for many different reasons. Phoenix allows us to deal with back rows, Cerberus monsters, and Mermaid points down, while also giving us access to Ibli, which does enable a lot of other really cool plays as well. And so all 3 of these are definitely mandatory. I'm not playing Goblin, Unicorn, or Griffin, mainly because I don't have them, but even if I did, I think I would try to make space for Goblin and Unicorn. Both of those are pretty important, especially Goblin. Unicorn does offer a little bit more utility, but I don't think I will play Griffin, because Griffin's effect isn't the best in this current format. Like, you're just going to lose it to an afterburner or something. Like, it's a solid effect, but it requires you to make certain plays to be effective. So like, you have to make Curious to dump something that's good enough to set, or you have to like link it to something else to do anything. And so it just requires a little bit too much to be useful in my opinion, whereas the other nightmares are like good as soon as you summon them. And so if you do have access to the other nightmare cards, I would play Goblin and Unicorn, but probably not Griffin. And then the final 4 cards of the extra deck are really just kind of some generic Link monsters. We have 1 Link Spider, 1 Ib the World Chalice Priestess, 1 Decode Talker, and 1 Firewall Dragon. Link Spider is kind of important for specific combos for Curious, because we can make Curious with Link Spider, which is Earth, Cerberus, which is Earth, and then Cleave Genius, which is Earth, and then there's a few other Earth monsters in the main deck, so we can make Curious with that. Ib can protect our cards, which is a very neat effect, but it's also used for Curious. So it's water. We can make it with Mermaid and Shizuku, which are both also water. There's also another play where we can make Curious with Nightmare Phoenix, Kagari, and Flame Administrator. Those are 3 fire monsters. I don't play that combo though, but it's another possibility. Decode Talker is important for just like putting game on board, and so there are a lot of cases where I just need the damage, and being able to summon something that can be at max 3300 is pretty big. And then Firewall is probably the one I summon the least, but it comes up usually when I'm trying to put game on board, and I'll try to summon it under Akashic Magician to be able to excavate 4 cards, and also maybe use that Firewall effect to clear a card on my opponent's side of the board as well. And so sometimes you can just like link climb with your nightmare cards into this, and so you can go like Phoenix or Cerberus, pop a card, Unicorn, spin a card back. Well, I don't play Unicorn, but if I did, you could do that. And then you can go into like Firewall, bounce something else, Akashic Mill 4. So Firewall does enable a lot of plays as well. Cards that you will notice that aren't here are Borreload and Synergizes, mostly because those are kind of expensive. But also I do think that this is kind of a format where we don't necessarily need Borreload. And so Borreload is usually used for outing problematic monsters, but none of the decks right now really do that outside of Goki and Spiral, both of which will not allow you to just make a Borreload simply. But also, like, for you to make Borreload, you have to link climb so much. And so you have to be able to play, but they're not going to let you play to answer their board in most cases. And so I didn't really like Borreload in that regard. I felt that other cards came up more often. I think if I had it, I would still probably play it, but it would be close because the extra deck is actually really tight, because there are a lot of other cards that we can add in here, because we are already at 15, but there's still other cards that we want to put in, like Goblin and then Synergizes is also a very interesting play. Like, it's great in the case that you're able to combo. It doesn't necessarily add to the combos, but it does help you maybe draw into some defensive cards, which are good if you're playing a lot of defensive cards. But as you'll see, we're not playing like a lot of hand traps, and so there's really not much that we can draw into post comboing. And so Synergizes isn't necessarily the best option, but if you have it, then like it's a really good card to play too. So there's a lot of changes that we could make to this extra deck. I think cards that you could possibly take out would be like Decode, Firewall, and I guess maybe like Link Spider. Link Spider isn't hugely important, but if you don't have those cards, that's also fine, as you'll see. So like even without those really expensive link monsters, we still have a really solid extra deck that we're able to play. And the most expensive card here is obviously the Firewall, but even that isn't something that you actually need all the time. So like you'd be fine without Firewall. And so now that we have the extra deck in order, let's move on to for the ABC cards. We have 2A, 3B, and 2C. These are great, and I really like this ratio, but I am considering playing more of them. And I think it really sort of introduces an interesting paradox to where we don't want to draw them too often or in multiples, but they do function as combo pieces in conjunction with other extenders while also making you more resistant to hand traps. And so it's really interesting because playing more of them does increase the odds of drawing combo, but it also increases the odds of bricking on them. And so it sort of affects both positive and negative consistency. It's something to definitely think about. And so I am curious to see what you guys think about this, but it's also something that I probably need to run the numbers on to see which is more statistically significant. But yeah, let me know what you guys think about this ratio. Like, do you play 2, 2, and 2, 2, 3, 2, maybe 3 of each? Next, for the extenders, we play 4 different gadgets. In my opinion, these are some of the best extenders. They're great by themselves. Not amazing in multiple, so I don't think it's good enough to play 3 of each, but 2 of each gives me 4 total to see within the deck. And then they also give me a good chance of just seeing 1. Next, we have 3 effect veilers. These are the only hand traps that I play. It's also the cheapest hand trap, I think, and it's still a very, very useful one because you can still stop most of the top decks. You can stop the Candina play, like of course unless they have Lycoris in hand, but they don't always have Lycoris. A lot of decks are only playing 2, and so stopping Candina is a pretty likely play. It's decent against Sky Strikers hitting Kagari or Shizuku, good against Gokis hitting Isolde or any of their other cards. And while, yeah, sure, it's not the best hand trap, you can work with it. And it does have some advantages, such as not being once per turn, unlike most of the other hand traps, and being able to use it while you have other monsters, unlike Impermanence. And so even though it's not the best, it's still a pretty decent card. I think another solid budget option would be Psyframe Gamma, which does have double usage as a way to protect yourself from hand traps as well, because a lot of people are playing Ash and Droll, and they're going to try to use Ash and Droll on your hangers, your terraformings, pretty much a lot of your spell cards. And so if you can bait them into doing that, especially using like the mental game, then it makes Gamma a really, really good card. But it's also, again, good defensively against your opponent. So when you go second, you can negate your opponent's plays and then play on your turn. So it's a really versatile card that I would definitely recommend. But of course, the best hand traps of the format are Ash Blossom and Droll and Lockbird. Both of those are the best for stopping your opponent's deck. They stop all of the good decks right now, as well as like the not so good decks. But both of them are quite expensive, so they are not in here. Another hand trap that I do think is worth playing in here, probably more so than any other deck of the format, is actually Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion. And that's because it stops your opponent, but it also keeps them from using Called by the Grave on your Buster. And so like I mentioned before, Buster is an insane, incredible card, and usually when you play it, you're going to win. But the only thing it's really vulnerable to is Called by the Grave, because if they negate your tag out, it is a huge problem. Like it's really hard to come back from that because you have to start all over. You have to get 3 more pieces engraved and then go again, but that's not always possible, especially not if you resolve desires. Maybe you might have banished a couple of your pieces and it might not be possible to get another Buster. And so Called by the Grave is a big issue, and being able to negate that is very good, because usually you have to play around it. This allows you to play more freely and not have to worry about it. But again, the only hand traps that we are currently playing is the 3 effect veilers. And then the last 3 monsters we play are all 1-ofs. We play 1 Nightmare Corruptor Ibly, 1 Fairy Tale Snow, and 1 Orbital Hydra Lancer. Ibly is not necessarily a budget card. It's like $25–30 right now, which isn't cheap. It's not cheap at all. It was a pain for me to get as well. But the deck isn't free to play, neither is any deck in the game, and so this is one of the few really expensive cards that I do think is kind of necessary. Like, I tried it without Ibly, and there's really not a lot you can do. It's really hard to make Buster without this in a lot of cases. It really just enables so many different plays with Mermaid, and Mermaid is just an incredible card. Like, being able to discard from your hand is so important because it makes it so that you don't need that other piece in your hand to special summon one. You can also discard it from your hand. So giving you another way to move your pieces from hand to graveyard is just too valuable, and I think definitely worth it. Fairy Tale Snow is an interesting one because it's another form of defense alongside with Buster, which is nice. So if your Buster gets stopped or if you can't make Buster, you still have another way of playing defensively. But it's a really interesting time for it in the format to where against Sky Strikers, it really isn't amazing because their only monster that can be flipped face down is Ray, and Ray has a quick effect, so you will never flip that face down most likely. Against Trickstars, it can be decent. It is bigger than all of the Trickstar monsters, so it forces them to play around that. And so that can be an important factor, but it still isn't as impactful as I think we'll like, and not as impactful as it has been in the past. It's really good against Goki and Spiral though, I mean, unless they have Resort, but against Goki, it's really, really good. But I think the biggest thing about it is just having that other play. So like if your main form of defense in Buster gets stopped, or if you don't have that hand trap, which is important because we only play 3, I really felt that Snow was another important piece to the puzzle of making this deck a little bit more competitive. It's also a light monster that is not a machine, which also means it helps you make Curious and can be sent by Curious. And so if you have like Gadget and Snow or ABC piece and Snow, or any other combination of light monsters, which we do just play so many of them, it's gonna help you make that Curious. Now my favorite of these 3 is definitely Orbital Hydra Lancer. This is definitely one of my favorite cards in the deck, and it has a really interesting effect, so I'm gonna zoom in on this a little bit. And it can only be special summoned from your hand when you have 5 or more monsters in your graveyard, none of which with the same name, and then it has a quick effect to send the top 3 cards from your deck to the graveyard to destroy a card on the field. That effect does not target, and it sends from the deck to the graveyard. And so if you can't make Buster, being able to still summon this can potentially mill your ABC pieces to help you make a Buster, and then even once you do, maybe it can lead to the second Buster. Now the only stipulation is that you need 5 different monsters with different names, and then you need 2 different monsters with different names to resolve the effect, to activate and resolve the effect. But you can really fix your graveyard pretty easily with Fairy Tail Snow, which this synergizes with, or also with A. And so the only monsters that we really can get multiples of in graveyard are the ABC pieces, but A can fix your graveyard to make it easier to summon this. And so usually what we'll do is make Cleave Genius Buster turn 1, then when we tag out the Buster, it's gonna trigger Cleave Genius to search this. Then on our second turn, we summon this along with like the second Buster and the third Buster, and that's already like 9,000 damage plus Cleave Genius. And so this really helps us put game on board. It helps us clear the board more easily, because usually on that second turn we're gonna have this Buster's effect, Nightmare effects. So we have a lot of ways to clear the board and then put game on board. But this is also a good play if we can't make Buster, or if our Buster gets hit by Called by the Grave, or if something else happens. This is still a really solid card because it's not necessarily difficult to meet these requirements. And so I really enjoy Orbital Hydra Lancer in this deck right now. Obviously we play 6 copies of Union Hanger. It is one of the best cards in the deck. We want to play as many copies as we are legally allowed to play. For the extenders, we have 3 drones and 3 scapegoats. So we have 6 extenders total that are spell cards. And Hornet Drones is obviously an insane card that enables a lot of combos, most of which I already covered the other day in the combo video that will be in the top right corner of the screen. But there are other combos that I will make in a future video. And the Scapegoat is really good because it also enables a lot of different combos, such as being a 1-card Curious, which can help you summon your Buster Dragon, because again, Curious is one of the Link trifecta that's going to help us make other plays in the future. And then Scapegoat also synergizes really well with Cleave Genius, and so if we have Cleave Genius on board and then we use Scapegoat, we just summon 2 tokens to the link points and then search a card, like Orbital Hydra Lancer. And then once we start linking with the tokens, we can fill our graveyard up with the requirements for Hydra Lancer. And so it really turns like Gadget piece or double Gadget plus Scapegoat into a really, really good play, and like a better play than it normally would be, to where they're both like already good cards, but the synergy really makes it even stronger. And now one issue with Scapegoat that a lot of people think is that it conflicts with Buster Dragon, because you can't tag out your Buster and resolve Scapegoat because you won't have enough zones on the board. But I really like it sometimes. I like being able to have a Buster Dragon and Scapegoat because it allows me to not have to worry about tagging out. And so it allows me to sort of play around Called by the Grave a little bit more. And so if you're forced to tag out all the time, then you risk being hit by that card, which is pretty much an auto loss. And so I really like not having to do that. Or if you are forced to tag out, and then they do deal with the pieces or have Called by the Grave, Scapegoat is another set of things that they have to deal with, and if they don't, you win. And now another option would be to play Engage if you have them, but that card is incredibly expensive right now. But it's okay if we don't play it, because we still have 10 extenders, including these, and then the 4 gadgets. And so we have 10 extenders, which still makes the deck relatively consistent. Like, we still have a lot of extenders to help us make our Dragon Buster. Scapegoat is a little bit slow, but we still have that level of power from playing these 7 that will get us there, and then Scapegoat is just ridiculous. And the reason I'm playing these specifically versus any of the other extenders is that I felt that none of these really required an engine requirement necessarily. So like, Ibli is an engine requirement that we use for a lot of the combos, but it never actually is necessary. Like, we don't need Ibli to play these, but rather Ibli makes playing them better. So like, sure, with the combo with Hornet Drones and Hanger in the piece, we need Ibli for the full Curious combo, but even if we don't have the Ibli in our deck, or even if we draw it, we can still just make like a Cleaver Genius with Kagari in the piece and then summon the other piece and then make Buster. Like, we can still make plays, and we can do the same exact thing with the gadgets. Like, we don't need the Ibli in deck for them, and we don't need to play it at all, or if we draw it, it's still okay. Versus other engines like Brilliant Fusion, to where if you draw the Garnet, like, you can't use the Brilliant Fusions, or if you banish it with Desires, or if you already have used it earlier in the duel or something. Like, there's so many things that can go wrong with those, so it really lowers your consistency, and I didn't feel comfortable playing anything to lower the consistency in a deck that's already like not the best deck. Like, this deck is already gonna struggle simply because it's an ABC deck. Like, it's kind of weak to Trickstar, it's kind of weak to Sky Strikers due to Shark Cannon. Like, there are ways to play around it, so it really requires you to play with a lot of skill, and you don't want to just lose to your opponent's cards as well as your own deck. So I felt it necessary to really try to maximize the consistency in that way. But this is it for the defensive cards. We have 3 Shared Rides and 3 Caught by the Graves. Caught by the Grave is definitely necessary in any combo deck because hand traps suck and a lot of people are playing them. But then 3 Shared Rides are really good against the top decks, and they also help us draw into our deck more, so it can sort of function as a reactive extender in that regard, and we really want more cards that serve multiple roles. And so Shared Ride is a really important card to this deck. It helps the consistency a little bit, and again can be sort of a defensive card as well. And if we include the other cards such as Snow, Orbital, and Valor, you really have like 11 defensive cards total. So if we sort of add those in and toss these in as well, then we really have about 11 defensive cards total. And then we do also play a singular trap, and that is Imperial Order. So we have 12 defensive cards total. So again, having this many numbers of a card of a certain role really helps the deck be more consistent. So we have like hardly any engine requirements, but then we have like 12 defensive cards, 10 extenders. Finally, for the spells, we have some deck building requirements to make the deck a little bit more consistent. And so we're playing 3 Pot of Desires and 1 Upstart Goblin. And yes, I do think that we should play the maximum copies of Pot of Desires, because the only thing worse than banishing all of your pieces is not drawing any of them in the first place, or not drawing Hanger. And so I'm perfectly okay taking that risk, because usually you can play around it and statistically it won't happen very often. And so I will gladly take those losses. And then Upstart Goblin is still really good to help improve your consistency a little bit, and despite the life point gain for the opponent, it usually doesn't matter when you make Buster. Like, I don't care if you have 1,000 life points, Buster has 3,000 life points, and so I'm still gonna end your game in like a couple of turns, or maybe even a singular one. And so I'm happily okay with Upstart Goblin. Sometimes I'll side it out game 3 depending on how much time is left on the clock, but in most cases it's A-okay. A-okay. But let's move on to the side deck. First, we have 2 Kaijus. These are just for going second in general. They can be against anything. Again, I wasn't sure what decks I was going to play at my locals because I don't go very often, so I wasn't sure what I'd be seeing, and so I wanted to side pretty generally, and I felt that these were just good against a lot of things, whether it be Spiral, Goki, Mirror Match, Dinos, or anything. These are just pretty versatile, and I wanted to be sure to play the machine one, that way I can search it off of Cleaver Genius. Next, we have 3 Chaos Hunters. Chaos Hunter is a really interesting card that I felt also covered a lot of bases. It was good against like random graveyard decks, it's good in the mirror, it's good against Trickstar especially, to where they summon their Lycanroc, I summon Chaos Hunter and they can't reincarnation me, which is really important because like you can like search cards with B, and then if they banish them with reincarnation, then it sort of stops C from resolving sometimes, or they might banish that one piece that you needed that you couldn't get banished. Or like maybe if you resolved the Desires earlier, so you banish one of your A's, then they reincarnation the second A. Like, things like that can happen and make it really difficult to play around reincarnation. This stops that, on top of being a way to discard cards to the graveyard, which can be good for both Snow and Hydra Lancer, or just ABC pieces. And so I really like this card a lot, and it's big, so it forces Trickstar to play weirdly to get around it. And so Chaos Hunter is a neat card. Next, I have 3 Cherries and a double Helix. So this is mostly for spirals obviously, but in the main deck I do play Firewall, which isn't the best Cherries target against Goki, but it's something, like it maybe won't get me killed every now and then, so it kind of makes cherries a playable card, but it sold as like 20 bucks, and so I wasn't really trying to pick that up either. And I felt that this was the best thing to sort of side against Spiral, since I also can't play like Evenly. Well, Evenly's not amazing against them either, but I don't have Droll or Sphere Mode, so I guess cherries is sort of the best thing to stop decks like Goki and Spiral. So it felt good. It was a fine card to use, and in case I played against a mirror match, it would be okay. I could also sort of banish some of the nightmares. That's kind of a play ill, but it's possible. Cherries was okay. Again, I think if you have Droll, then Droll is like a better card because it stops the same decks, but I think Cherries is still probably like a better card. It just takes up a lot of space, especially with our extra deck not really having space for cards like Isolde or Double Helix, so having to side 4 cards for a matchup is kind of hard, kind of not good, especially considering Spiral's representation. Like, it isn't the most popular deck, but you have to side for it, and this is the best card to side for it. Raw Sphere Mode is another option, but they can play around that. And I also couldn't find any Sphere Modes, which is weird. Next, 3 anti-spell fragrances for any decks that play a lot of spells, namely like Sky Strikers, or it's okay against the Trickstar deck. It's good against a lot of decks, and it sort of goes with Imperial Order. And it's interesting because you can set these and then make Cleaver Genius, and then negate it on your turn, and then play your spells. So like, these hurt your opponents way more than they hurt you. And so I really do like playing these Floodgates. And then the final card that I play in the side deck is 3 Mind Crushes. And Mind Crush is a really good card this format. It's extremely versatile going first or second, and it's really a luxury that we can side this in going second because none of the other decks will really OTK you outside of like Goki or Spiral, which also don't really OTK you, but you know, an extra link or that full Nightmare board might as well be. But I think that Mind Crush is a really good card because as opposed to Shared Ride not necessarily stopping your opponents, Mind Crush does. And so Shared Ride can be an interesting card sometimes to where like if you set it and you don't have anything to stop your opponent with, like we don't really play a lot of hand traps for them to draw into, they can just kill you if they're playing like Trickstar or Goki or something. Like, they can just kill you because it puts you in the scenario where you have to draw one of the 3 Veilers, which it's very likely you won't, and so they kill you. But Mind Crush is something that actually does stop them, and so they search like their Candina, you take it out of their hand, boom, turn over. And so I really like this is actually a defensive card that can be used to stop those decks versus just slow them down or give them a choice, which is something that's kind of lacking from the other cards in the side and main deck. Especially in the main deck, to where most of the defense that we make sort of depends on being able to make Buster. But alright guys, this has been my Sky Striker ABC deck profile. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, this is a budget build, so I think there are a lot of improvements to be made, but I think this is the best version of the deck that I could have possibly made. And so again, I think the extra deck is pretty much as good as it can get. The only changes I would make would be maybe adding a Goblin and a Unicorn, potentially a synergizes. Borload is sort of like a personal preference card in my opinion. Like, you don't need it right now, but it's good to have. In the main deck, we could change up some of the extenders, so like we could play Engage instead of maybe Scapegoat. We could play different hand traps like Ash and Droll. Obviously those are insane cards. I think Gamma's good. There are a lot of better hand traps than just Veiler, but Veiler isn't, you know, Veiler will get you there. Then in the side deck, there are again some other pretty decent options. I think the side deck's probably pretty solid right now. I think a lot of the changes in the side deck come from changing the main deck. And so like if we have Drolls and Ashes, for example, we maybe don't need the cherries just for like Double Helix and Goki. Like, we'd have the other hand traps for it, or we could just play Sphere Modes instead. But not having those cards necessitates us to play our side deck a little bit differently. Other than that, I think the side deck's pretty good. I especially like the Mind Crushes and the Chaos Hunters. Those are probably my favorite 2 cards. Another card I've been thinking about is Secret Village of the Spellcasters, because we can make Ib so easily. And so like Ib plus Secret Village is auto win versus Sky Strikers or a few other different decks, and so that's an interesting idea. So there are just a lot of different directions we can actually take this deck. And if you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and like it, because again, when this video gets to 150 likes, if it ever does, I will do an ABC guide for how to play ABCs on a competitive level. And so pretty much the point is, if you guys enjoy ABC content, like these ABC videos and I will keep it coming. And so thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next video.